Yeah, so again, I mean, my emphasis here in this presentation is going to be more on sort of like, what is Plessner trying to do overall? And then we can get into the weeds as we need to. I think what he's trying to do overall is to start to show how this thesis that he's articulated in chapter 3, that life is defined by a certain feature of its boundary structure, that's how things appear as living to us in our experience. That thesis, that's the fundamental feature of living things as they appear, or living things as something that we have access to in appearance or in experience. How that explains or makes sense of, or is the foundation for, or is a necessary component of, or a condition of possibility of these a number of different features that have been noticed as features of living things, like, for instance, typicality, that is falling under a certain type or species or larger categorization, individuality, development, death. Later, he's going to be talking about systematicity, and he draws on Driesch and the idea of harmonious equipotentiality. So what happens later in the chapter, and it's really the sort of main meat of the chapter, is going through some of these characteristics of life that have sometimes been pointed to as remarkable, distinctive features of life, and explaining them in terms of this thesis about the boundary relation. And I think that there are, in terms of what we read for this week, really two big parts here. So the first two sections of the chapter, as I read them, are just articulating different relatively fundamental and comprehensive ways of expressing the basic thesis articulated in chapter 3. And he runs through a number of different ways of articulating that, some of which he'll draw on again and again in subsequent discussions. So one of these is the idea of living things being out beyond themselves and over against themselves. And the translation, there's care taken not to say out beyond themselves, but rather out beyond it, matching Plessner's usage in German, because he's going to reserve that kind of self terminology for very specific kinds of relation between organisms and their bodies later in the text. But that's one of these relatively fundamental and comprehensive ways. And another is the notion of positionality, that living things are they in a way, they sort of take a place or have an orientation to place that goes beyond the sort of first level of spatial relations. So it's something kind of an extra dimension of space in a way that they occupy. And again, I think it's important to see that these, as Plessner sees them, these are almost like, for Kant, the different formulations of the categorical imperative. Kant says at one point, they all ultimately say the same thing. I think that that's what Plessner has in mind for these. These are all ultimately different ways of saying the same thing, which he's articulated earlier as, for instance, maybe I'll just skip quickly to the next slide because it gives a larger set of these different ways of articulating this. But earlier he described this as the dual aspectivity being something that is had by the entity as a property, that whereas non-living objects have this core periphery distinction, living objects, living things, have the kind of opposition between the inner and the outer as a feature of their being, or as of something that we perceive or experience. He also describes it in terms of space-likeness. He connects it, or space-likeness, which is interestingly distinct from spatiality. And the German there is Raumhaftigkeit, which I can't help but read as a kind of like space-havingness, even though I think that's a bit of a stretch for the German, but it sounded that way to me as an English reader. Space-havingness, space-likeness is what the translation has. And he connects it to the idea of like teleology, of being directed to something, goal-directed, and of having a kind of freedom of types of being on the way to, or freedom of characteristics on the way to whatever its goal or tendency is. So he connects it with these notions of freedom and of teleology or directedness, that again are part of the long-standing discussion of like what characterizes living things. So he's sort of connecting his thesis with these other ways of talking. He also describes it as a regular irregularity or discontinuous continuity, and as plasticity, interestingly. So just a brief remark on that. I've been working a little bit on the concept of plasticity in a sense it's broader than just what Plessner says about it. He doesn't say much about it. It's just a few sentences here. But a thing to notice about the idea of plasticity is that plastic things both are changeable, alterable, and variable, but there also has to be a continuity in plastic things, or else they're not a single thing. So there's kind of both the continuity and discontinuity at work there, and likewise regularity and irregularity. So living things have this appearance based on these descriptors of regular, irregularity, discontinuous, continuity, of having a kind of pattern or logic or rhythm, he calls it at one point. But it's also somewhat discontinuous or spontaneous, or appears to not be fully regular. And again, phenomenologically, that's part of the appearance of living things. That's a characteristic of how they appear to us. So all of this, and at the end of one of these sections anyway, he says, I think the first of these two sections, he says, I don't really feel the need to stress this connection between the boundary structure and all of these features of life anymore, because I think the point is obvious enough. I mean, there's sort of the basic point that I'm trying to make with this is obvious enough, but he still needs to do what he calls a deduction of these organic modals, features of living things. And he starts that process. He's doing it in sort of the most general possible way in this chapter. And in later chapters, he's going to make distinctions between, for instance, organic modals that apply just to plants versus those that apply to animals versus those that apply to humans. And that will take him through the end of the book. So this deductive component, which I read as a kind of like deduction of the category. It's a deduction in the Kantian sense or the Hegelian sense of deduction of categories. It's a sort of showing that these categories really are essential to the thing, or really are conditions of possibility of the appearance of a thing like this, is what he's engaged in this chapter and the remaining chapters. And so let's dive into some of those sections. So in section 3, we get discussion of process and becoming, types and typicality and individuality. I'm going to go through these slides again more slowly, but I just want to give you an overview quickly. In section 4, we're going to get a discussion of development. And in section 5, we get a discussion of death. So in the section on these topics, Plessner asserts that living things exist in the mode of becoming, but they are not just becoming. They change, but their change also involves persistence. And he describes the unity of this becoming and persistence as process. And he also describes living things as existing as a dynamic form. Their existence implies a form idea, Gestalt Idee in German, or a type that they instantiate or exemplify. And he tries to draw a connection here, again, between the boundary structure and this kind of falling under a form idea or type, and the way in which they fall under a form idea or type. So it's important that they are neither just identified, fully determined by a form idea or type, and also that they're not just like free-floating process. They're somehow constrained by this form idea or type, but they're not determined by it or fully identical with it. So there's a kind of freedom in their manifestation, a kind of individuality that they have in relation to this form idea or type. And all of these characteristics for Plessner are supposed to be they're logically connected with one another. You know, it's that living things can't fall under the form or idea or type in the way that they do if they aren't also individuals. And they can't be individuals in the way that they are if they don't also fall under a form, idea, or type in this way. So it's very dialectical in the Hegelian or Marxist sense, in the sense that you're pulling apart different moments or aspects of a thing that has a kind of larger coherence that comes to appearance for us in the analysis by looking at all of these individual parts and then seeing how this descriptor, the descriptor of falling under a form, idea, or type, inevitably involves, as a condition of possibility, being an individual as well, and vice versa. So in the next section, he talks about development, and again, this is another thing that is thought to be sort of intuitively, we might think like, well, this is characteristic of living things. Living things go through processes of development. And I think what Plessner is trying to, I don't think I've got all the details of this section at all, but I think what the strategy here is to articulate what it is that's distinctive about development in contrast to other kinds of processes. What is it that makes a process a developmental process? And I think that that involves both, as for all processes, it has to involve continuity and discontinuity. But it also has to involve a kind of progress. It has to involve some kind of movement towards something. And again, it can't be a movement towards something where the something is fully determinate or the movement towards that something is fully determinate. There has to be a kind of freedom in how the development occurs. So it's both, you could say, constrained but softly constrained, or it's constrained but not determined. He describes this as structurally as a kind of line of progress that, because of the necessity for continuity, continuously involves circles that are a kind of repetitions or holding on to some kind of stability within the process that retains identity in the process. So again, we need this process to both be one that doesn't become just change with no continuity. So we need that kind of circling backwards, but we also need it to be a progressive process. And if we have both of those components, then we have the idea of development. So that's supposed to be his deduction or reconstruction of the idea of development. And he says, note that this is connected with the form idea, the Gestalt idea that he described earlier, that the form idea is a kind of goal of development, that development is occurring in service of this form idea. And this means that we should understand later phases of development as somehow above or including earlier phases. Now, I'm not entirely certain, due to the limitations of my ability to go into detail in reconstructing it for this session, I'm not entirely certain what, just what Plessner is even saying here. But if I've understood correctly that he is claiming that this form idea is above earlier phases, I think a natural kind of response, if we understand what he's trying to do, is to say, wait a minute, shouldn't we say that all the phases of development are equally part of the form idea, right? Because, I mean, in what is a species typical life history, right? It includes adolescence as well as old age. It's not that old age is the goal of the developmental process. That can't be right. So what is it exactly? And maybe he has in mind some kind of like ideal homeostasis or healthy condition of an organism, so that like maturity, form idea and maturity is the thing that's the telos. But I kind of, I wonder whether we shouldn't say that all phases are equally part of the form idea. And I gave a possible reply here, which is to say it has to do with the temporal asymmetry between later stages and earlier stages. But maybe that's not right. Maybe this idea of like the mature, healthy condition of the organism as the kind of telos is more accurate. And then finally, in the last section, he talks about death, and this is going to wrap up my presentation. So he's concerned to articulate a view that is neither of two alternative views, one of which he calls empiricism, and the other he calls him a priorism. Actually, it may be that he considers more than just confusing it, but he's certainly concerned to reject the idea that death is an external thing, either a material thing or a ideal thing. And he's concerned to reject the view that death is somehow desired by life, or it's somehow something that is produced by, or an inherent force operative within life itself. And in connection with that, he ends up rejecting what he calls empiricism, which would be the idea just that, like, look, it's just a fact. We all die. Death occurs. There's nothing more to it than just the fact of the ending of life, or which connects with, say, a kind of materialism about death, or a priorism, which would be the idea that death is itself an idea or a product of life itself. And he engages with Fichte and Hegel and their views of death, interestingly, trying to make these points. But he does think that there's something, in a way, true about each of these partial but ultimately incorrect accounts, because death, in his positive view, is indeed a confrontation with something beyond life. It's not just produced internally to life, but it's a confrontation that is inevitable given the structure of life. And so he actually connects this with the kind of back movement of life processes themselves. And I wasn't entirely sure how that was supposed to work, but there's a line or two where he does that. And I think part of what he has in mind there is that it's there has to be no, I think I'm not going to be able to. I might not be able to do more than that. That's enough to get us started. So then, and I was happy to put this on the slide, partly because it was an objection that I had as I was reading that I felt was answered, which was, well, what about natural death, right? This is sort of not, I mean, I'm sorry, what about unnatural death? That even like the description of death is something that's sort of inherent to, but that's inevitably something that life must confront, seems to be only considering, say, old age and natural death. But Plessner says, no, I mean, the external component of death, the fact that death is a confrontation with something beyond life, is actually really well exemplified by the phenomenon of unnatural death. So I think what he wants to take on board here is both the sense that life inherent to its structure can't last forever. It sort of it exists in a process of kind of struggle, or of turning over something that is not itself into itself, and that can't go on forever. It confronts the it includes in its operation kinds of negative or destructive elements that make death an inevitable ultimate outcome. But at the same time, that's what I was trying to say earlier. But at the same time, so that includes that, and that thing that it includes, that negation, is somehow connected with its relation to an existence outside of itself. Another way to put that would be its finitude, right? It's connected to its limitedness in the face of an environment. And that's where unnatural death shows that kind of external dimension of death, right? So it's actually that even the internal dimension of death involves that external dimension. It's just not as, it's not as obvious, it's not as clear to see. And I think we have to say, conversely, even the external dimension of unnatural death involves the internal dimension of what does it take for life to sustain itself, and when is that compromised, or when does that come up against its its unsurpassable limit. So I hope that that's at least gotten us started on talking about the details of this. And I'm very happy to get into like particular passages if you want. All I was trying to do was just start a discussion.
Oh, Phil, this was actually very good. Thank you very much. I mean, given the enormous complexity of the chapter, that was quite something to be able to narrow it down to these main points. And then, of course, we can, take it from here, basically.
Thank you.
So yeah, does anyone have any comments or questions? Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I have two comments. Part of them is just I'm finding this chapter difficult to get my mind around exactly what he was arguing. But I just a comment. It would have been very helpful in exposing this by him if he would give some examples. For example, I'm trying to think what would we do with a virus. I mean, in terms of this analysis that he's given, I just am difficulty fitting some of that comment in. But the more substantive point is I kept feeling I was reading in some particular this discussion of development and life and form idea and so forth, that his interlocutors seemed to be Driesch, Kant, the idealist tradition, and he's developing certain kind of distinctions within that. And yet I kind of kept feeling like, well, I'm really reading Aristotle here. I mean, in sense that it seems to me that so many of the points he's making are those that we see in Aristotle's biology in terms of the relation of teleology to development and so forth. And I think that the difficulty, as I've seen it with Driesch, is Driesch never makes a distinction between substance and matter. He takes the notion, sort of a scientific conception of matter, and then he adds on to this an outside or some kind of entelechy. But of course, with Aristotle, that would not be, we would be making a clear distinction between substance and matter, and the questions of teleology and development and so forth concerns a much more a conception of substance rather than and so I think it's completely wrong, and you're not doing this, but to read Aristotle as a vitalist. I don't think he is a vitalist for those very reasons. But so some of that is, I mean, he never mentions any place of ever having, been in discussion with Deinema that might have been helpful at some point in clarifying where he's going with this, because I think a lot of the positions he's developing seem to me to be emerging in something like an Aristotelian direction, but I may be misreading him. I mean, so at least I'd throw that out as a question for discussion.
That's great. I mean, I had the same sense, and yeah, Aristotle never shows up as a reference. I mean, I was trying to remember if it's in, maybe it's Metaphysics 1 or maybe it's Physics 1, book 1, but he does this long engagement with Parmenides on becoming, and it's very similar actually about kind of the reconciling the contrast between change and stasis in becoming. Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question to ask, like, how much of what Plessner is doing here is he doing with a conscious reflection on Aristotle, or thinking I'm somehow talking about the same things Aristotle was talking about in a different way in order to make my points.
Because I mean, with, say, for instance, Deinema, we get this notion that formal, final, and efficient cause are all kind of are all included in the notion of psyche or soul, and so we don't have separations of these in sometimes in the way in which they've been interpreted in the tradition as something, a final cause being outside of the organism and so forth. And so I found some of the passages in there, I kept marking in the margins. I said, this sounds much like what I'd be getting out of Deinema, but at least that's my reading, but I'll shut up here.
No, I mean, I find that really useful. I have to go back and look at Deinema for exactly that point. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So going back to the Greeks, Yeah. Any further comments and questions? Yeah,
I'll just
Bill.
have one other thing I'll throw out is that it seems that he would be committing himself to a position that would be to some extent anti-evolutionary. I mean, in the sense that things are realizing their form idea and they're kind of restricted within kinds, so that the only kind of evolutionism we could begin to get would be some kind of saltational views. But I mean, he uses the term evolution, but that probably seems to mean in the classical sense of unrolling or unfolding rather than anything like Darwinian theory at the time. But that's again just an observation I would make.
But that's an
Yeah, I
interesting
think that's
point, yeah.
true, Phil. And in my reading, there's almost nothing in this book that touches on evolution in like the Darwinian or Lamarckian kind of cross-generational sense. There's just almost nothing. So I think that's a major oversight. I think there is some literature that tries to defend, like Marjorie Green did this, for instance, tries to defend the indispensability of certain kind of typological thinking, even among evolutionary reasoners and, you know, in evolutionary theory. And Plessner might fit in that tradition. I think it's not inherently anti-evolutionary. It just requires some kind of account of how you can both think that you, in order to experience life or identify a living thing, you have to somehow think of it in terms of it's fitting under a form idea, and also believe in it, you know, also have believe in evolution. That requires some kind of story.
Yeah, and the form idea doesn't seem to be simply you know, an epistemological assumption. I mean, there's something real that he's giving a realistic interpretation, it seems, to this notion of form idea. That's where, I mean, where I see it more Aristotelian than Darwinian, but that's enough. I've said enough, so I'll let everyone else talk there.
I would just maybe add to this last point that there is, he will be engaging in a discussion about the relationship between theories of embeddedness and theories of adaptation. And by theories of embeddedness, or maybe he uses some other term, I'm not sure. It's Anpassung and Einpassung. So you have the Uexkulian tradition where the emphasis is on the fact that living organisms seem to be surprisingly well adapted to their particular environment or milieu. So that's the idea where you have this embeddedness. And then you have the adaptation idea where you have this ongoing struggle to fit into the environment. And he's trying again to find some sort of a middle way out. So this is where he might be said to be kind of tackling the Darwinian position, and then indirectly maybe evolutionary questions, maybe not, you know, straightforwardly. But he will touch upon these topics, and he will try to kind of again try to find a middle way. He will not adopt the strong Uexkulian reading of the you know, the specific animal or living organism types fitting into very specific milieus and having some sort of a harmony that is simply there, and you know, it's perfected because it's too static. But he will also refuse the Darwinian adaptationist approach as well. So he will try to open up a middle way by, you know, trying to retain some of the Uexkulian ideas, but make them more fluid and more dynamic. And I think that this is precisely what he's actually trying to do with his conception of the form idea or Gestalt idea. I think that this is a very it's basically a crucial idea here, or a crucial notion here. You would probably agree. And I think that it would be nice if we could maybe say a bit more on this. I would just like to maybe throw out some of the things here out in the open, and then maybe we can discuss them. So one thing that is clear here is that the notion of Gestalt idea is a close relative of Goethe's ideas of you know, Urpflanze, and so all the Ur notions that he uses. So this proto-animal, proto-what have you. The thing is that very quickly and easily one can understand this as being something almost Platonic or very static. And he's constantly trying to dodge this bullet. So he's constantly trying to show that this is not exactly what he means. This is not what he means by the Gestalt idea, by the form idea. What I found very helpful with regards to this was his comparisons between Gestalt idea and the notion of death. So in the last section that we were supposed to read today, let me just see if I can find it. Yeah. So one of the things that he talks about there is, I'm not sure whether I'll be able to find it now, but he says something like, whether, death exists in and of itself. If we kind of, what we're given is always like a contact or touch between the living being and death. So, but the question is then, what is death in and of itself? And he says that someone who is thinking in those terms has completely misunderstood what he's trying to do. So even though it's a form, death is still something that occurs only in dying. So and given the fact that he draws a strong parallel between death and the form idea is something that is constantly dynamic. It is not pre-given either before or later. It is given only in and through the manifestation of it, in and through actualization. But it is never exhausted by a particular something that is given in one spatial temporal slice. You can never get it that way. And this was precisely the Goethean point when he was talking, for example, about Urpflanze. It was not when you were kind of looking at, at a particular plant or something, and if you wanted to get to the proto idea or to the proto plant, you wouldn't get to some sort of static Platonic eidos. This was not the main point. What you need to do was actually to grasp this plant in its temporal or its developmental dynamics. So this is the Urpflanze, how it manifests itself dynamically in and through specific slices, Yeah. And this is something that is somehow, always in a certain sense presupposed by a scientist. This would be the Goethean and also, I would say, a Plessnerian line of argument. And you can do natural science within it, but it is not something that would be given to you, as he says, in this sensual, empirical manner. You never can grasp it in this particular way. It can be given intuitively. It is given intuitively, but it is not given in sensuous or sensual intuition, what we talked about previously. So empirical, it's not given empirically. It's not given in experience, as he says, but it is given in intuition. And this is precisely the Gestalt idea, the way I understand it. Gestalt idea is a certain type of form, but it is a dynamic form. So to put it differently, it's closer to what in terms of dynamic systems theory, you would call an attractor. So it's an attractor. So, it's something that constitutes itself. It has a certain stability, but it is a metastable structure in the sense of that this stability is only a specific step in a larger story, a larger dynamism. So I think that this is something that he's constantly trying to kind of grasp. This is the terminology that he's trying to develop. And this is the reason why the Gestalt idea is neither before nor after, because it's never fully constituted. That's the main point. Just like death is a necessary possibility, so Gestalt idea is a necessary possibility. It is not an actuality. But as soon as you posit something before or later, then you're always kind of thinking only in terms of actualities, fully formed some things. Yeah. But you lose precisely this dynamism. And I think that this was the way that I was kind of thinking of Gestalt idea.
Just to add a footnote to that, very good, very helpful discussion. It really makes a lot of sense out of, for instance, jumping over the waters and also seeing in England, in Owen's notion of the archetype. I think that's been so badly misunderstood because these dimensions you're talking about are exactly what seems to be involved here. It's not something that's an empirical object, nor simply a Platonic form, but it's really going back to the tradition of Kairos and then to Goethe on that same form, is that it is a dynamic principle that is also unifying our various concepts. And I think where Darwin says, Owen's archetype is my ancestor, we see immediately the jump from the one to a concrete material object that would be which is to do that, which is one of the crucial moves that Darwin makes in The Origin. But I think your point was very good here. Now that Plessner really developing more in that Goethean view, in which we don't find empirical objects, which are the form idea, but they become something, a dynamic, teleologically directed structuring principle that is necessarily temporal, historical, and also dynamic. But I found that very helpful, what you were saying on that.
Maybe just an analogy here, because he's constantly also emphasizing this idea that we shouldn't like posit that Gestalt idea is something that is separated from something that would be ontologically separate. So he's constantly trying to find a way that would not end up in Driesch's radical position. So he's in agreement with a lot of the things that he's saying, but he doesn't want to end up in the position that would posit an entelechy as a separate ontological principle. So an interesting maybe analogy might be when I start saying something. So when I start producing a sentence, right? This initial impetus opens up. So, you know, the first few sentences are already set. So they're out there, they're explicit. But around them, there is a horizon that is implicit, horizon of possibilities. And it's impossible. It's in a certain sense, almost inexhaustible after I make 2, 3, 4 steps. But on the other hand, it is not completely contingent. So there is a certain structure there that delimits the way I can go after I've taken these steps. And I have the impression that what he's saying is that, you know, when something unfolds within the organism, it has a certain movement, but is not completely determined. Like, you know when it will go off because it becomes sick or dies. But sometimes something extremely unexpected happens and it's not detrimental. Just like sometimes you start a sentence and people would expect that it will be a normal sentence, but you end it in a completely different way, and people are shocked, but they say, well, that was brilliant, you know, that was brilliant, that explained something so marvelously, or, you know, what a great way of putting it. So I think that this is something, this is one way of thinking about what this Gestalt idea could be. So, you know, there is a specific structure, but it is in the realm of possibility. That's one thing. And it is necessary in the sense of that, you know, it's not completely contingent, because you can also have completely contingent possibilities. You can toy around with a lot of things, but, you know, it's outside of the realm of the initial impetus that I gave to that particular sentence, or the beginning of the sentence, you know, to the birth of the thought, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian, for those explanations. It really helped me. But I'm asking myself a question. So far, I could not grasp the difference between this Gestalt idea of Plessner's and Gestalt as it is defined by Gestalt psychology, because I think this is exactly what is meant by Gestalt as understood in psychology. It's a principle of organization. However, it is not static. It is tied. It is not tied to a particular material, let's say, and neither is it beyond those materials somewhere in the ideal world. So it's exactly what we are talking here about. So it's the principle of organization that is dynamic, and it can be transposed over different conditions. So I would, I really, I think, understand better based on your explanation, but now I also need to kind of get more help to distinguish this from the Gestalt as understood in Gestalt psychology. Or maybe you will tell me that it's the same thing. Because I understand why he's not using the term Gestalt, like, because he doesn't want to have it static, right? It's not just a form, like, or it's not just linked to some specific material or situation. But you know, for me, well, that's it. That's what I want to ask.
If I can give this a go or a try, I think that you're in the right track when you said that the emphasis on dynamism is important, but it's not crucial. So it's not enough to just be dynamic. It's important to have to be processual in the way that he describes it, and this has to involve precisely this element of internal impetus. So it's not enough that a given something behaves as a whole that then, you know, changes dynamically with regards to external circumstances, as for example a bubble might, you know, a bubble might change and might act or behave as a gestalt. What is important is also that this particular gestalt somehow is self-referential or is somehow in relation to itself in such a way that it establishes its own conditions on how it will develop itself. It is such a gestalt that has determines the impetus that will be given to the words, to the sentences. So it doesn't just accommodate to the external circumstances, but it somehow imposes itself on these particular circumstances. So this is precisely what the idea is of being out beyond the body and also over against the body. So, you know, it always transcends itself, so it goes out of itself, but it also goes within itself, so it posits itself. So it posits itself externally, but it also posits itself internally. So I think that would be my response. And in the Merleau-Pontian sense, of course, he would use the term Gestalt for both physical, vital, and mental. But he would say that these different orders of Gestalt are structurally very different. So, of course, you can use the term Gestalt still. And maybe if Merleau-Ponty and Plessner had this conversation, maybe Plessner would say, yeah, you know, makes sense. This could be Gestalt as well. But it's it's a qualitatively different type of Gestalt.
Thanks, that's very helpful.
An interesting question that raises, just to flag it, is which of these characteristics are supposed to be sufficient conditions for life, or which are just merely necessary conditions. And I think so, for instance, becoming is something that a lot of even non-living things and systems participate in. And it might be that Gestalt idea even is something that even non-living things participate in to some extent. So I think that's to some extent an open question. It seems like his main aim here is to show how features that are held to be characteristic of life can be traced to the boundary condition. Ultimately, there have to be some distinctive ones. Like there's this line at the very end of the reading, for instance, where he says the law of he says that the law of process determines everything that takes place in time, but fate only determines living things. So that implies that everything he said about process earlier, or at least a lot of it, applies to non-living things. Anyway, I just wanted to flag that open-endedness of interpretation there.
Yeah, any other angles that you might want to explore?
Could we return to my initial puzzle? What would he say about a virus? I mean, this is something that's coming really on the scene just about the time he's writing, is the real appreciation of viruses. And how do we fit something like that into the categories which he's talking about here?
Phil, would you want to have a go at this?
No, I really don't, but I'll force myself to say something about it. I mean, I think there are a lot of similar questions to be asked about like microbial life in general, because it seems like a lot of like some of what Plessner's saying has a pretty direct application to microbial life, but some of it doesn't. I mean, like for instance, I don't know whether like death is an inherent feature of cell lines or not. I mean, cell lines, you tell me, Phil, is death an inherent feature of cell lines, or is there such a thing as natural death of cell lines, or can cell lines propagate indefinitely?
I would think probably indefinitely, at least. I don't see any particular terminus in any cell lines I can think of immediately. But
so I mean, that suggests, I mean, I guess there's the phenomenon of like, RNA or DNA mutation, which has to be repaired, or else the Gestalt ideal will change, you could say, which could be considered a kind of death. So yeah, but I mean, I think to extend the analysis into the microbial world, viruses included, would require probably some revisions to that account, it seems to me. But an interesting thing about viruses is part of why it's a puzzling question, I think, Phil, is that it's not clear whether viruses are alive. So, I mean, a sort of natural Plessnerian response is, well, if you look at viruses, you'll see that they have some of these features that characterizes living things, and they don't have others. So which ones do they have and do they not have? Like, what is the what about the boundary structure of viruses? To some extent, it seems like viruses are really, the boundaries of viruses are really contingent. It's not really the boundary of the virus that defines its identity. Viruses kind of slip in and out of those boundaries, right? And so in that sense, that sort of that leads us to sort of not find it so intuitive to say that they're alive. On the other hand, you might say, well, it's not the cell, it's not like something like a cell wall that's its boundary. It's like the actual sequence of DNA or the actual sequence of RNA that's the boundary. So anyway, I'm improvising a little bit, but I mean, that it seems to me that's one natural strategy, Plessnerian strategy, is to say, well, it's an ambiguous case precisely because it hits on some of these intuitive features of life, but not on others.
Yeah, I mean, the question here is that in one sense, it seems to fit many of the properties of inorganic objects. You can crystallize them, they have, and things of this kind, and yet they do have abilities of self-replication and so forth. So they seem to form some kind of intermediacy between, he must seem to me to make some fairly strict distinctions between what would be Gestalt in an inorganic item, and then what would be this kind of unusual boundary questions in terms of a living being. And of course, we can see that we get, macroscopic objects, but when we get down to the microscopic, it just seems, and I think that's, of course, where so much of the whole discussion about the nature of life and what is life and so forth has hinged on what is happening at these microscopic viral at atomic levels rather than at a macroscopic level. So that I just don't know if he's pretty thought out what this would mean for some of his argument there.
I would go out on a limb here and say that according to Plessner, viruses are not alive, because they do not actualize the boundary. So they do not manifest the boundary properly.
That's what it would seem to be requiring. Yeah.
So he does go into it in the appendix. He's basically summarizing a variety of theories, but he doesn't really make like a final judgment They do seem to exhibit a kind of membrane or a kind of boundary, but he's not sure if this is really enough to say to make some kind of a final proclamation. But I also think he goes into it in the preface just briefly. It doesn't really go in depth.
So we have a nice split here into right and left Plessnerians. Based on the question of are viruses alive?
But isn't it a matter of degree even for those beings that we can call alive unproblematically? Isn't there also a limit, like or there? I feel like even if we accept that, okay, they are self-organizing and they have a direction where they are kind of heading in this process, this has to have some limits, because also at a certain level, well, the organization kind of has to stop, or it's kind of there is no more organization there at certain kind of level of analysis. So I'm thinking, well, maybe the difference between the virus and the properly living is just a matter of degree of this capacity to gather those materials into the process of the kind of directed process of self-organization. Just a thought that maybe even this Gestalt idea shouldn't be understood kind of absolute way, but just as a matter of degree, perhaps.
Well, one thing I would perhaps offer here is that I think the problem with the virus is that it cannot actually realize its boundary on its own. I'm not really a biologist, so maybe someone can correct me here, but it is dependent on the realizing its boundary through the cells of other cells. So maybe that's something to consider.
So it's ultimately parasitic form of life, and it would be interesting to have engage more of the discussion of this with a virologist who might be able to help us on that.
There should be plenty of these days.
Then again, you can say, well, metabolism, that's also kind of maintaining yourself or the a self through materials that are external. So again, it's similar in some respect.
That's true. Maybe I would just say I have the impression that Plessner would want to argue for a very categorical split. So I think that in his view, in order for this theory, a prioristic theory, to stand, that there is such a thing as a aliveness in its robust sense. Of course. So he would say something that like there are these indicative characteristics, indicative vital characteristics that could be present in many different things. So he provides that example of the fake snake and whatnot, and there could be many other examples where you see a certain rhythm or a certain movement, and something seems as if it were alive. But I think that his main point is that you have to then basically see if that these indicative characteristics are useful for a biologist when they kind of study the living beings, but then eventually they have to get to these essential characteristics, and if they have to be there, and this boundary realization of the boundary is the crucial one. So whether a given organism realizes its boundary, that would probably also mean that you would be able to find most, if not all, indicative characteristics there. But it's a good question. It's a good question as to how do you know if a given organism or if a given entity is actualizing its boundary. I think that the only way you can tell is if it does manifest the things that he says, such as being a processual being, being a being in development. So all these things have to somehow be probably present for it to robustly fit into the category of the living. So yeah, that's. By the way, just Phil, when you were talking about the development, the question of development, and you raised a really important question about why there would be development, and the how this relates to the Gestalt idea and whatnot. So I was just the way I was when I was reading this, the way I was thinking of these things is he's constantly trying to basically say that all these other aspects that he's describing, so processuality, which can be divided into becoming and persistence, that they all have to eventually be explicable through the two main key characteristics that are related to positionality, namely that of being out beyond the body, so the living body being out beyond the body, which means that the body is open to its environment, while at the same time it is over against the body, which means that it is closed off the environment. So this dual processuality has to be present in everything that happens. And I think that what Plessner would say is that the only way that you can satisfy these two conditions simultaneously is by having something like a spiral going on. So, if you want to have both things happen at the same time, you have to have something like development, so that there cannot be, if you just have self-referentiality, you can end up with a stale circle where you just, kind of repeat the same thing over and over again. So there is no becoming. But if you have just becoming, you get this linearity, and this is also something that is not okay. So development in the sense of that you have a certain sedimentation of a given structure, but it still opens, when it's sedimented, it opens new possibilities, the horizon of new possibilities. And in the next step, it sediments again, slightly alters or even radically renews the horizon of possibilities. And this is what can only be achieved if the entity is developed, according to Plessner, if I understood him. So I think that he would say that development is necessary if you want to meet the two fundamental aspects of going out beyond and being over against. They kind of force you into then saying, well, then this has to develop.
Yeah, I think that, that clarifies a lot. I want to read Plessner in comparison on development, in comparison with the developmental systems theorists like Paul Griffiths and Russell Gray, the famous paper from '94, where they really emphasized developmental systems as a framework for understanding living things. They talk about that in terms of cycles too. I guess if you think about it, like, what are the alternatives, right? What's the alternative to development? And then you see that it has to be either like just something purely static, or something that changes to the extent that it no longer is what it was before, change without continuity, right? Even if you have a thing that, say, changes, I think the important thing is you can have a living thing that, say, goes from state A to state B to state C, back to state A to state B to state C, almost perfectly identically in each of those states, right? But don't you have to have a little bit of change each time it goes through those states? Don't you have to have, in order for it to be living, that is, right? Don't you have to have a little bit of narrative beyond that? Or another way to put it is, doesn't there have to at least be the possibility of narrative beyond that? Doesn't have to be the possibility of it not just going A, B, C, but shifting over to D at some point, right? Which means there's a possibility, there's a possible narrative, there's a possible development, right? And so I think when you think logically in terms of, like, what are the possible alternatives, and you see that none of the possible alternatives to development in that very basic logical sense would count as living, then you get Plessner's point. But about out beyond and into, I'm still, like, a question I would like to think more about, if I had time, is how each of these individual components that are discussed in this chapter in each section really can be traced back to the boundary structure. Like, is it that the boundary, like, if something has the boundary structure that Plessner is describing, then it has to develop. If something has the boundary structure that Plessner is describing, then it has to fall under a Gestalt idea, you know? And for each one of those, like, what's the basis of that has to claim? What's the basis of that, you know, claim of a tight logical connection?
That's a good one, yeah. I don't think I would be able to provide a satisfying answer here, so maybe somebody else might give this a go.
Maybe I can work on it more for next week, since I'm going to present on the last part of the chapter. Sorry.
I'd like to hear from what our female members of the group would like to say about any of this.
Any brave souls?
You left the most difficult question for us. It's unfair.
Well, do you have any,
But
any questions
I have
yourselves?
yeah, I have a question. I was wondering if these conditions are necessarily related to the individual level, or if we can think of the level of the species, for example, the virus. If the development can be thinking in terms of mutation, for example, or if it's necessary to think at the level of the one entity or one organism.
Also, I think related to what Leticia just said, this idea, I don't know if I had problems for connecting before, but I don't know if you already touched on the topic of the Gestalt form, because like this is split into a Gestalt form, and also this saying that it's not a singularity but an individuality is also like confusing to me. So I don't know if it's related maybe with like, I was thinking with Gestalt form, something like a body plan, but I don't know if it's somehow related to that.
Yeah, Phil, so go ahead.
No, I think that issue of you know, this Gestalt form or Gestalt idea and body plan, he doesn't use quite that terminology of the Bauplan, but that's intriguing to me too. I think you raised an interesting point there, Susanna. Yeah, and can we? Because I always feel like I'm translating a lot of what he's saying into some other categories that I'm more familiar with. Even trying to think of examples in organisms that would work, but that's one which may have more, you know, more connection with some of the questions that even Leticia is raising in her comments.
Yeah, Philip, the reason for this is at least partly the fact that we've mentioned before. For instance, you know, the idea of Bauplan developed by Uexküll, and then the idea of Gestalt or the idea of Gestalt idea developed by Plessner. They are both Goethean in origin, so
Yeah, right.
you know they both kind of go back to this notion of Urpflanze and all that, and they are both trying to articulate it somehow. The main point is, you know, so this is a very interesting point, because you know, when you look at these German thinkers, they're basically kind of all drawing on similar tradition, and then it's all a matter of fine-tuning. So how are you going to understand the notion of Uridee, for instance? And within that particular tradition, this is a valid question, and they can develop elaborate arguments about this. And then someone, for instance, to speak somewhat loosely, coming from an Anglo-Saxon tradition would just be like, I don't understand this. So it's just like, I don't care. And you have this complicated structure where you have these nuanced debates about something kind of swept aside almost, at a very fundamental level. But to go back to this point, before Susanna, we were kind of trying to tackle the notion of Gestalt idea, and the direction in which we went was that it is to be thought of in dynamic terms and in terms of possibility. So that the problem is, if you try to understand it as something that is fully constituted or actual, be it in the past or the future, it is something that can present itself or give itself only in and through its actualization. So it's given intuitively, but it's not given in any particular spatial temporal slice of what you see, but it is precisely the dynamic gestalt that is somehow actualizing itself in and through this thing that you see. So it has specific, let's say, morphological structure, but it is not completely determined. It is not, actualized. It is in the process of actualizing itself. So it is open at a given specific level in the present to maybe take specific different directions. And you cannot fully foretell where it might go. You can maybe, have a good guess about it, like anyone working with dynamic systems theory might be able to say, well, this system might behave in this way, but then you have these outliers and whatnot. So, and the question about the different layers, individual and then the more collective, that's a very interesting one. I was also thinking about this when Phil was talking about the question of development, and for me it was also unclear whether this refers to one particular organism or maybe say to a specific species of a given something, and how these are intertwined when you talk about development, because you can talk about development in many different levels. So any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a little similar to the discussion with an autopoietic theory, and to what levels can we transpose the basic autopoietic functioning of the cell, and I think then that's somewhat related. But the impression I got is that he's mainly talking about kind of the individual living being, not really as a species, but he's really looking at not just some concrete being, but as a kind of a type of a being. But I don't think it's the same thing as saying he's looking at a species. I think it's somewhere in between, I suppose. So yeah, it's a kind of an ideal type, ideal representative of a species would develop, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I think that maybe the problem with the notion of species is that you, again, have this very static understanding of it. So you have the idea that there is like a very specific category that fits to a certain something. So it's a certain natural kind that is there. The idea of the type is precisely that is dynamic, right? So it's something that you cannot pin down in the same way that you could pin down a certain species. Because if you look at species from a processual perspective, in a certain sense, you might say, well, there aren't no species, but then somebody might say, of course there are, and both are right according to Plessner. But how do you think that? So I think that this is where he tries to squeeze in the notion of Gestalt idea and the type, the way he understands it, as something that is in the process of development, and that is it is a certain whole or generality that is given only through its actualizations. So you can never capture it because it's in the process of forming itself, and it can always surprise you. So you can always it has a general structure, but it's not something that you could calculate in advance. You have to see what happens in order for you to know, oh, this is another manifestation of it.
But it would be possible for Plessner to talk about boundaries at this level, at this, the level of the type or the, not species, but this. Can we think about these boundaries at this level?
I personally wouldn't say so. I don't think he would say the species or some multiple organism kind of unit has a boundary. The boundary is the feature of a particular living thing, but I suppose we could transpose in a certain way with certain modifications a similar idea to a more to multiple organisms or to groups of organisms. But I think the boundary is really individual in the end.
This makes me think again, though, going back to my friend Aristotle, where the notion of eidos means both shape. It also is, he was talking to anima as eidos, as soul, and also, but in abstract in thought, as what we would call species or related to genera. So these things are related in an interesting way, so that eidos in the individual, as the individual form, is also seen as an abstract universal in thought as species, but nonetheless it's instantiated in form as a dynamic principle that is not separated from the individual object or the individual entity, so that we have a very complex relation. And it seems to me that Plessner is sort of hitting around something like that, so that would seem to me very Aristotelian, even though he doesn't use any of this particular language at some point. But it seems closer to Aristotle than anything else I've been able. It's not Platonic in all of these sorts of ways in which we put categories on things, but it seems very Aristotelian in what he's trying to say here. But I may be overreading this, but
perhaps we should attempt a Platonic reading of Plessner, the ideal types as Platonic ideas.
well, that's I'm taking an Aristotelian this as a sort of alternative to Platonic. Instantiated form, in mattered form.
That's very useful, actually. It seems that we'll have to go back to Aristotle soon.
Yeah, I think this is a very good point to note, that this meme of going back to the Greeks, which gets kind of jokingly repeated these days, how important it actually is, because these ideas have been gone through at a certain point, maybe not in the exact same form. And I feel like often we are trying to rediscover the wheel, but sometimes some of these, if we just went back, we would maybe save ourselves some of the hassle of going through the same hoops over and over again. Because even if we look at, for example, at autopoietic theory, Varela in activism, they dealt with and encountered some of the same issues which we already can encounter and deal with in Plessner, for example. And this is a good example of why you need this historical overview and also this interplay and the constant cross-referencing of ideas to really be able to push forward without getting stuck in some kind of a circle.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I had I think I saw something a bit differently about the relation between Gestalt ideas, types, and species. I think, I think what Plessner wants to say is that even apart from thinking about species and the debates about species, if we look at a single individual living thing and experience it as living, we can only experience it as living by referring it to some kind of Gestalt idea. Now, why would that be? Why is it different when we experience a living thing from a non-living thing? What's that relation to a Gestalt idea that's different? I think it's that with the living thing, we have a sense that there's greater kind of, there's a kind of tendency or a kind of norm to its behavior, but there's also freedom in behavior in reference to that norm. And if you think about it, that's very similar to what he's described as the structure of the boundary, right? There's both a kind of identity, but there's also a transcendence of this identity. And there's a kind of freedom of direction of that identity. So if it's true that even looking at a single individual thing, abstracting from our concept of species, it could be Aristotelian, it could be Darwinian, it could be whatever. If looking at a single individual thing, we have to refer it to a type, then that means that the project of articulating categories of living things, which has run through Aristotle, Linnaeus, Darwin, and maybe post-Darwin stuff, all ultimately is grounded in that basic phenomenon of what life appears to us as. So we could then do a lot of different things with our categorization, but whatever we do is going to be somehow also doing this thing of relating an individual to a type. So here's one thing that I think that helps to clarify. We sometimes appeal to a species category to understand what we expect an individual organism to do. We sometimes appeal to a species category to say where an individual organism comes from historically. Okay, and those are very different functions of appealing to species concepts. But both of them are treating an individual as somehow representative of and somehow an individual in reference to a type. The one that relates the individual to the species purely historically is relying less on the species to inform us about the individual, right? And in anything other than its historical origins. So anyway, that's I wanted to share that with you because I felt like I saw it in a different way thanks to Letitia's question and the discussion.
Yeah, that's very good, actually, Phil. So maybe I would just like to press you a bit further. Could you then now elaborate on how you see this relationship between the category of species and the idea of, so the notion of Gestalt idea or the form idea? So how would you say that they are related if you just hone in on that particular issue?
Yeah, I think I would say that whatever one's, well, yeah, maybe I have to put it a little bit differently than I did before. I think I would say that referring an individual to its Gestalt idea is similar to what a number of thinkers have done when they've appealed to a species. But it doesn't have to be identical to what all thinkers do when they appeal to species. Like, for instance, in the Darwinian tradition and phylogenetic accounts of species. And that doesn't, even if it's not what's going on with all species concepts, like phylogenetic species concepts, for instance, that doesn't negate the Plessnerian point that we can only understand an individual organism by reference to some kind of type. Say you had an individual organism where the species was evolving very quickly, and a few generations back, or the organisms of that species were very different, and a few generations forward, they're going to be very different. Plessner's point would still hold, right? That you can only understand an individual organism by thinking about it in terms of the scope of its possibility in development. You have to think of there being some kind of constraints, but also some kind of openness in its development, and under some kind of Gestalt idea. So my point, I guess, is actually about the survivability of the Plessnerian point, even in a post-Darwinian or Darwinian post-Darwinian concept of species. Yeah, is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. There's a I would say a natural corollary here. Namely, this is something that I was also thinking about. Is a Gestalt idea, something that could be explicated on the same level as a species is, or do you think that maybe the Gestalt idea that he's referring to is something that is in a certain sense larger and broader in scope, in a way that encompasses the aliveness of living beings as such? So what I'm trying to say is, or what I'm trying to ask is whether, you know, the notion of the type, but he uses the notion of the type, that this then seems to delimit the Gestalt idea to something that would be somehow akin to something like species, right? But on the other hand,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I think you understand where I'm going with this. So
maybe not, but I mean, I think the point, I mean, I would describe the Gestalt idea, the connection between experience of a living thing and its reference to a Gestalt idea, as more fundamental and more primary. It's built into our experience of things as living. As long as we experience things as living, we're going to be referring to them to a type idea like that, and changes in phylogenetics won't change it. Like, it might be that our changes in sort of species concepts won't change it. And so some of the early species concepts, or for instance, like Aristotle's species concepts, or species concepts in ethnobiology, for instance, probably are pretty close to this Plessnerian notion of a Gestalt idea. And probably a lot of Darwinian theory ends up doing the same thing. People still appeal to the species of an organism to explain what that organism will probably do or how it operates. Some of what we do with species concepts now is track evolutionary history, and it doesn't really have to do with like explaining or understanding that individual in terms of its behavior. So I think sometimes species concepts no longer are that closely connected with the type idea, with the Gestalt idea. But I think Plessner's point, and the way I would defend Plessner's point, is I would say there's something more fundamental, phenomenological, if you like, a condition of possibility of experiencing things as alive, which is relating them to a Gestalt idea.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I was asking this is, you know, because the question here is then, you know, what the relationship would be with, say, between the Gestalt idea and concepts. So when you see a certain something, you might say, well, this is a cow, you know, it falls under the category of a cow. But this is not the same as saying, you know, that there is a certain type that is actualizing itself in this particular living being. So when a type is actualizing itself in this living being, is it merely a type of aliveness as such that you see, so that you see, aha, now this here is a living being, or you see something that could, you know what I'm saying? You know, in the level, in the domain of concepts, you would have different levels. You know, you might say this is a living thing, and then you might say, well, this is a mammal, and this is, you know, and somehow, but are they also, do you think, I know that you don't know all these answers to this question.
Well, I'm gonna just read really quickly just one passage. It's on page 128. He says, this allows us to understand the inner reasons, that is the stuff he's gone on before about type, behind the law of the type governing all of organic nature. Nowhere does a living body occur, so to speak, as an absolute singularity. And what it would be an absolute singularity would be seeing something completely without reference to a type, completely without reference to like scope of possibilities, so on. It is always perhaps the only case of a type, and is subject to a graduation of typical units that are ordered according to grades of kinship. The typicality, and thus the possibility of categorizing single living things into particular levels, is not a lucky circumstance that happens to suit the interests of systematic biology. So I think that allows for a lot of different kinds of categorization. It doesn't require that there's only one kind.
Great. This is superb. This passage is precisely what I was inquiring about. This is marvelous. Of course, I've read it, but you know, I forgot it. So it's basically, when we were talking about their different, let's say, realms of possibility, or somehow are opened up, and of course you can then articulate them in different ways. They're not contingent, but they can be different. You know, like you said, you can categorize things differently and classify them differently, but within the scope of these particular types that are given to you, and they are then related, as he says, in different ways, and they are graded as well. So okay, that's useful. He should probably do more work on explicating some of these things and how this then relates to conceptuality, because it's an interesting question, right? Yeah, that was very useful.
That seems
Yeah,
just one comment that seems to introduce us to something he doesn't talk about, but Husserl's notion of intentionality here. That what's the intentionalities behind our various ways of categorizing or looking at things, and it would be interesting to explore that. That to me was an interesting point.
I mean, I was joking before, but all this talk of Gestalt ideas and these types, which don't seem to exist quite on the level of species, but are kind of more fundamental and yet transcend these kinds of categories, keep drawing me towards actually a Platonistic direction, where you also have this worlds of particular things which partake in the ideas and are recognized as these things by virtue of partaking in the ideas, which are defined in a way, constrained by the ideas, and also kind of develop against and with them. I think there could be a lot to play around with in this direction. Because I feel like we're constantly in science, we're kind of shifting between this Aristotelian takes and then when the Aristotelian take kind of reaches its limits, we switch to the Platonistic take, and then back and forth. I mean, I guess we can all do the rest if you have time, because if we're in a hurry, we can just.
I think I'll
Call
go.
it a-
I've got to go pretty much.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
it's a good point about the worry about Platonism.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we can just call it a night and pick it up next time. Unless someone has some extra comments.
Oh, very good. Good discussion. Good discussion.
Yeah, it was.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot, Philip. That was very, very helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah.